go. Okay, so today we are talking about harmful algal blooms, aka HABs. Does someone want to read this for us to just remind us why we're here and what the overall goal is? How about Karen?
I knew you were going to do that.
Because you're such a good speaker.
Okay, the Delta needs us. The San Francisco Bay Delta, a freshwater body formed where the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and several smaller rivers meet near the city of Stockton, is the largest natural estuary on the West Coast. It covers more than 1,100 square miles. It provides breeding ground and habitat for a range of animals, including Chinook salmon and the endangered Delta smelt. I should probably say endangered Chinook salmon too.
True.
The Bay Delta's ecosystem has dramatically declined because of excessive water diversions, introduced non-native invasive species, and water pollution. Now the Bay Delta's future and function is threatened by a proposal to build a single tunnel that would divert millions of acre feet of fresh water from above the delta to parts below the estuary.
Thanks, Karen. That was great, as always. Here we go. So what is a harmful algal bloom? An algal bloom is the overgrowth of microscopic algae or algae-like bacteria found in waterways growing through photosynthesis, and these can be normal and critical to aquatic food webs, or they can be toxic. An algae bloom becomes harmful when it emits toxins that can hurt other organisms, and they're usually blue-green in color, at least in the delta that we're talking about. So a little science background. It might be a little science heavy today, but sometimes that's fun, right? So some of the most commonly occurring genera of, and that's plural for genus, that's a word I learned today. So the most commonly occurring genera of cyanobacteria are Microcystis, Dolichospermum, and Planktothorax. The most common blue-green algae species in the Bay Delta is Microcystis. Many of the bacteria in this genus can produce neurotoxins, hepatotoxins, such as microcystin and cyanopeptylin. I think for the most part, we're going to be talking about microcystin today. Microcystis is the most common bloom-forming genus, and it's almost always toxic. Microcystis blooms resemble a greenish, thick, paint-like, sometimes granular material that accumulates along shores. Scums that dry on the shores of lakes may contain high concentrations of microcystin for several months, actually, and that allows toxins to dissolve in the water even when the cells are no longer alive or after a recently collapsed bloom. Dolichospermum blooms may develop quickly and resemble green paint. In less eutrophic waters or stagnant waters, some species also form colonies, and those look like large dark dots in water samples and on filters after filtration. Planktothorax form long, slender, straight filaments that usually remain separate but form dense surface scums. Its presence may be revealed by a strong, earthy odor, and the filaments are easily detected visually in a large water sample. So how do HABs affect us? Sorry, that looks a little blurry, doesn't it? In the past 40 years, HABs have grown in number, intensity, and duration, impacting the safety of our drinking water, our tribal subsistence fishing, tribal tradition and cultural practices, fish and mussel consumption, recreational uses, and ecosystem health throughout the state and through California tribal lands. We can become sick from HABs by swallowing the water, swimming in it, eating contaminated fish or shellfish, even when it's cooked. Inhalation, including while showering. So maybe you're breathing in the steam, you're trying to avoid your face from the shower, but you're breathing the steam in and having that water on your skin. Through exposure from contaminated water and medical treatments like dialysis, unfortunately. And then dermal exposure by direct contact of exposed parts of the body to water containing cyanobacteria cells. We're also thinking that it could be on clothes sometimes too, if it splashes nearby, if you're walking by an area that has stagnant water, but maybe it's splashing anyway. Cyanobacteria cells can accumulate in bathing suits, particularly diving suits. And then sometimes farms may accidentally irrigate crops with contaminated water. It's kind of coming from everywhere. Dr. Taylor Weiss, an assistant professor at Arizona State University, says that fatal toxic algae works the same way as VX gas, referring to an extremely toxic compound developed for chemical warfare. It inhibits your ability to fire your neurons to control your musculature, and that leads to paralysis. This is how chemical weapons work, and there's really not a chance or time for intervention for some of the more serious cyanobacteria. That's not for everything, but some of the more serious ones. Late in the Cold War, he says, the CIA was actually using antitoxin in suicide pills for agents who fell into enemy hands. It's also, the compound is referred to among scientists as the very fast death factor. So even among the less serious ones, HABs can do a lot of damage, including to the central nervous system, to the liver, and it can lead to respiratory distress. They can produce endocrine disruptors. Symptoms can range from mild, like skin rashes, to severe symptoms, including death. Acute illnesses caused by short-term exposure to cyanobacteria, especially including during recreational activities, can include hay fever-like symptoms, skin rashes, respiratory and gastrointestinal distress. But exposure to drinking water contaminated with elevated concentrations of microcystin can cause liver and kidney damage. Microcystin can also cause abdominal pain, headaches, sore throats, vomiting, nausea, dry cough, diarrhea, blistering around the mouth, and pneumonia. So if you do come into contact with water that has been known to be contaminated with it, the CDC recommends that you rinse off right away with clean, fresh water as soon as possible. Seek medical treatment right away if you think that you or someone you know have been poisoned, especially if you have any of the symptoms that were mentioned above. So HABs in wildlife. The first documented case of a harmful algae bloom took place in the 1600s in Poland, when dogs, cattle, and birds died after drinking from a lake that exhibited a hairy efflorescence, is what they called it back then. Then in the 1870s, after livestock began to die near a lake in Australia, a man named George Francis published the first ever report about the algae's lethal effects in the journal Nature. The first recorded HAB in California was in 1925 after a dog fell ill from drinking water in Clear Lake. Last year in Botswana, 356 elephants died near watering holes, and the officials concluded that they had indeed ingested toxins from a bloom. HABs can lead to very low oxygen levels in the water, and that's called hypoxia, resulting in higher mortality rates in local fish, shellfish, invertebrate, and plant populations. The blooms may also cause decreased light penetration. The toxic blooms from some cyanobacteria generally lead to decreased plankton, which is a food source for many fish and shellfish. Cyanohabs can also harm pets, wildlife, and livestock. Pets and other animals can be poisoned through drinking the water or by swimming in water with the HABs. Pet and livestock deaths have been reported after exposure to these toxins. Symptoms in pets can include excessive salivation, fatigue, difficulty breathing, vomiting, diarrhea, and seizures. Death can also occur within hours to days of exposure. If you suspect a HAB is present, don't let your pet drink the water, don't let them play near it or eat any of the scum mats or swim in the water body. Then don't let your pet lick their fur after swimming in contaminated water. If your pet has come into contact with water with a HAB, rinse them with tap water as soon as possible and get them to a vet. So where do these come from? Why do we have HABs? So some of the biggest causes of HABs are nutrient loads from discharge, and two of the biggest nutrients that we commonly see are nitrogen and phosphorus. So these discharges might come from municipal and industrial wastewater in treatment plants. It might come from concentrated animal feeding operations, so maybe a little bit from the food, but mostly from the animal waste. from municipal separate storm sewer systems, stormwater associated with industrial activity, from diffuse runoff from agricultural fields, from roads, and stormwater that are high in nitrogen, or when excessive fertilization kind of flows its way down to water in a nutshell. They're caused by warm water, so the temperature is a huge part of it, from the heat, the stillness of the water, and bright sunlight. And we know that all of that is affected by climate change, and all of that is affected by reduced flow, which is a huge problem in the Delta. HABs are aggravated by glyphosates, which are a form of pesticides, and that includes Roundup, because it kills other invasive species and just kind of flourishes that algae. It's caused obviously by reduced freshwater in our streams, and then pH changes. They tend to be around pH level 9 and a lot of times, and trace metals. So I think that a lot of these point to the problems that we already see in the Delta, that when we have reduced flows and there's less water running through, of course, that's going to mean that the water is going to heat up because there's less of the water for the heat to circulate. When there's less water, it can't be flowing. So of course it's going to become still. And then when that water is thinner, when it's thinned out, it's going to be exposed to more sunlight. So all of these things together are kind of a recipe for disaster. Water Board staff have observed an overall increase in the duration of HABs statewide. Historically, bloom duration tended to dissipate in a matter of weeks to a couple of months, but based on data the Water Board has collected, water bodies with HABs tend to persist now for longer periods of time, even around 6 months. And then in some areas that are hit really bad, they're here year round. They're not drying up, they're not going away, they're here year round, and they're coming back year after year. So HABs are proliferating in the Delta region because half of the state's fresh water runs through the area, and the water carries with it nutrients from the discharge upstream. And I think we know that the Delta is surrounded by heavy ag areas. The discharge could include runoff from ag, from manufacturing systems, municipal waste, and then a lot of times homeless encampments on rivers, particularly in Stockton, from dated wastewater treatment facilities, so ones that maybe haven't gotten the repairs and updates that they need. It's being proliferated by marinas that are out of compliance, and boaters who don't discharge using proper discharge facilities. And then, of course, naturally occurring changes to the environment. Whether climate change is part of that, we'll see. So as we find, it's the conclusion nearly every concern in the Delta, it's really always the reduced flow of water is worsening this problem. There's just not enough water flowing through it to flush out the discharge that's getting in there and the runoff and the toxins, of course. What we're learning now is that 40,000 people in the Delta regularly eat fish caught in the Delta. And if you were part of that DWR survey or DWR webinar on their environmental justice survey earlier this month, or I guess it was last month now, they said that 90% of their respondents who were from a disadvantaged background, 90% of those people said that they eat fish from the Delta region 4 or more times per week. So that means it's a lot of people who are eating fish that could potentially be exposed to these HABs. And if they eat the fish, then they're exposed to it as well. There are several hundred unhoused people living in camps along the rivers and they use the water for basic sanitation. So bathing, hopefully not cooking, but that's always a possibility. And then cleaning up after restrooms. Stockton's youth have increasingly reported feeling unsafe using the waterways in the area for recreation. And that's really an unfortunate example of environmental racism. And because there's a lot of research supporting the link between environmental degradation and the school to prison pipeline. So when we take away those opportunities for young people to get out in nature, to do more active things, what does it kind of turn them to? Data from incident reports is increasingly showing that several drinking water reservoirs in the State Water Project, which are usually around the Delta region, now have recurring annual blooms. So every year they're seeing HABs there. And then obviously the tunnel would proliferate all of these. I think in a nutshell, we know that with the tunnel, a lot of that water is going to be diverted to exports down to the Central Valley and to Southern California. So as the tunnel takes away water, all of these problems would just be exacerbated. So what are the existing policies on HABs out there right now? First, we'll talk about the big bad voluntary agreements. We spoke about the voluntary agreements last month, so we won't get into it too much right now. But you know that the voluntary agreements would basically be an unregulated way for local water agencies or state water contractors to kind of take as much water as they want, unregulated by the state, just within agreements with each other. So with those agreements not being regulated, it's kind of a recipe for disaster for folks taking as much water as they want out of the Delta. And like we said, less water in the Delta means more HABs and other problems. One other kind of sidebar issue that I think is important to think about, especially in terms of an environmental justice perspective, is that the public has a right to recreate on public lands. And a lot of regions in the Delta are heritage trust sites. And so when we close off parts of the Delta, we just put up a sign that says, oh, there's HABs here, you can't swim here, you can't be over here. You know, you might be protecting people from it in the short run, but then we're denying people access to these public spaces that taxes pay for, that they have a right to enjoy. So just putting up signs and telling people not to go there is not really a true solution. That's just a Band-Aid on the problem. According to a report prepared this year from the State Water Board, incidents of harmful blooms have now doubled between 2018 and 2020. So 2 years alone, they have already doubled, which is not a good sign for climate change and drought and everything else that we're seeing. For some locations, state-sponsored monitoring programs are underway in some of the areas where we are already kind of seeing them being hit the worst. Oh, sorry, my notes are freezing. Areas like the North Coast and Central Valley, where we see these blooms are kind of out of control, only getting worse, not going away, repeating year after year. Areas like that, they are now being monitored year round. And then this was part of a bill, HAB 834, that kind of deals with all things HABs. And then there's also a section that mandates that they report on it now publicly. So this is called the Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program, aka SWAMP. And the state board started developing a HAB strategy. This started in 2016 when this was a program they kind of created that had some infrastructural ideas and milestones that kind of protected the public by informing citizens of the risks of HAB, saying here's where they are, here's what to look for in water quality. But then it wasn't really formally staffed or funded, and it didn't really have the support that it needed to address all the complex issues. So that's why they passed HAB 834 in 2019 to require all these things, to force the state to act and fund it. And then they started the Freshwater Estuarine Harmful Algal Bloom Program, or FAB. And then things really got rolling a bit better. So now that they have this bill passed, it requires the State Water Board to post on their website any incidents of HABs from the last 3 years, and then the actions taken and the recommendations that would keep people safe. The State Water Board is now also working with the California Cyanobacteria and HAB Network and the Voluntary Interagency HAB-Related Illness Work Group, or otherwise known as the Illness Work Group. And then they have staff from all different water boards, and they coordinate with the Environmental Health Hazard Assessment and the Department of Public Health and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So we're finally seeing that states are addressing this as an interagency problem, that they're kind of taking it a bit more seriously, finally. And then anything that they find that does seem to be serious, that anything that creates an illness or a mortality in humans or in animals, then gets reported to the CDC. And then they created their own system called the One Health Harmful Algal Bloom System. So just in the last few years, we're seeing a lot more changes happening. In this last year, in 2021, the fiscal year, the Budget Act authorized 5 new staff positions related to HABs in the North Coast, Central Valley, and Lahontan. These are areas where the HABs are kind of the worst, and we're seeing them year round, and that they don't really slow down. So they work with the HAB coordinators and the regional boards. So now they're getting the regional boards and the state board to all kind of get a little more streamlined. The pandemic slowed things down, but they finally filled all those positions by the end of June. So they're getting there. Prior to formal legislation, they did have some standardized incident responses. They had a HABs portal for agency staff, but they had pretty limited training opportunities, and they couldn't really help out with other agencies. But now we're getting to the point where all of the agencies are getting trained, and then they're working together with the water boards. State board is now increasing ambient monitoring and assessments. So that's kind of like year round, just checking in, but then they've really stepped up their monitoring right before seasonal holidays. So before we see people kind of hit the beaches in big numbers for like Memorial Day, 4th of July, just to kind of give folks that extra protection. We also have, under the Drinking Water Protection Act, the EPA then developed an outline to really understand the impacts on human health and step it up there in their public health and safety protections. And then we've got the Safe Drinking Water Act, which in 1996 started listing cyanobacteria as something to consider besides just heavy metals and other toxins. They update this every 5 years and have been including new toxins, new types of bacteria. So we are advancing quite a bit. Here's a map, an incidence report map that came from these policies, from these bills. If you click on that link, you can see an interactive map. That's where you can report any incidents that you see of HABs. And what you see right there, unfortunately, is all from 2021 alone. The different colors are different severity, size, duration, but now at least we have a better way of mapping these and following them. So the whole reason why I wanted this to be our topic this month is because of the recent victims of the HABs. Ellen Chung and her husband, John Garish, that's their daughter, Miju, and they had a cute little dog. Hi there, can you mute yourself? Great, thanks. This is sad, you probably heard about it in the news, but this family were experienced hikers. They went for a hike just from their own house up a trail behind their property. They weren't that far from their home. They had been missing for a while. Someone went to look for them, and they were found deceased near the Merced River on a trail. It's still a bit of a mystery as to why they died, but pretty much everything else has been ruled out. They're leaning towards, they're pretty sure, maybe 90% sure, I don't know a number, but pretty sure that HABs are the cause of their death, because the HABs were found in the water right nearby them, but HABs don't stay, the toxins don't stay in the body that long. So we're still waiting for results from their autopsies, but it might not show up in their bodies at this point. It's hard to say. But they did close down the Savage Lundy trailhead around that area, and they had posted a warning sign about 2 months before that happened in this family, but I don't think that was quite enough. So, they're looking into this, but it's very sad, this young family. And, what does that say if these were experienced hikers, this was right here in our backyard, this could happen to anyone. And I think if we see the voluntary agreements enacted, if we see the tunnel built, if we see more exports from the Delta, more storage built, more climate change advancing, we're going to see more terrible tragedies like this come along. So some solutions, I think, in terms of the things that we should be acting on, we need to see more policies that reduce nutrient loads to the waterways. So like we said, the phosphorus and nitrogen that come from the runoff from ag and municipal discharge. We need to see some updated water systems, repairs to leaks, and things like that. Obviously, we need to reduce water exports and keep the water in the delta and other areas so that the water doesn't stagnate. Of course, we need to address climate change because that makes things hotter, makes it sunnier for photosynthesis. And then we need to address water circulation because we can't have that stagnant water there. So increased awareness has led to more reporting. That might be one of the reasons why we saw a double in, like I said, 2018 to 2020, a double in incidents of HABs. Maybe it truly was more HABs, or maybe just people know a little better what to look for and how to report it now that they've got this website up. So it could be either, but I mean, it's still obviously a good thing that we've got the tools now to keep the public informed and report it. But we have seen, especially with the drought conditions this year, we're seeing earlier reporting of blooms in water bodies in the North Coast and the Bay Delta in particular. There's been growing interest in collaboration from other agencies, and that's what we need to see. The more agencies that are involved in this, the better we can tackle this problem. And then we're also seeing that it's getting more media attention because of the drought and the wildfires. And when we kind of look at all these things together, we know that they all play a part. So, that might be the one silver lining of those other tragedies. As we saw that more money went to AB 834 and the swamp monitoring program, that's fantastic. But also the Bay Delta Quality Control Plan calls for more money for these swamp monitoring programs. And that, if you were in our voluntary agreement webinar last month, that is the plan that the state wanted to enact, that we support enacting, but that the water agencies and big ag, they want to see voluntary agreements instead of the Bay Delta Quality Control Plan. So because of that resistance, we haven't seen them move into the next phase of the Bay Delta Quality Control Plan. So that's unfortunate. If that plan gets the funding and attention that it needs, then hopefully we'll see more support for systems that can help out with the HABs. So it's one more reason why we need to eliminate the voluntary agreements. In terms of preventative measures, the most effective preventative measures are those that seek to control the influences that promote the blooms. So leaching, runoff of the nutrients, so especially nitrogen and phosphorus. We know nitrogen is a big one from manure, from over fertilization, so is phosphorus. And then we see other heavy metals left over from the gold mining eras, even that when they get kicked up. So when they, let me back up. So a lot of heavy metals left over from the gold mining era are heavier and they sink to the bottom of groundwater. But then as we run out of water, as the drought gets worse, farmers mine lower and lower and they suck up that water and they get the heavy stuff that sunk to the bottom. But then that stuff that they're pulling up only proliferates a lot of these HABs. So that's a major concern. So a lot of the preventative measures are aimed at kind of hitting these at the source. So devices that result in the mixing of the lakes, like air bubbling, they enhance the vertical mixing of the phytoplankton. So that minimizes the formation of surface blooms. So that kind of, as the water gets aerated and bubbles, it's harder for the water to just sit there and stagnate. But I mean, there are other scientists who say vertical mixing is not a good solution for HABs. I think that's something they're still working on. And then of course, we always want to target external nutrient input. So just reducing the amount of junk that's even created in the first place and having better systems of cleaning up what actually gets dumped from municipal, from industrial wastewater treatment plants, from concentrated animal feeding operations, all of that. We need that to be better, cleaner, less mixed in with our freshwater sources, and especially in stagnant areas. So I think there are solutions in the water treatment, direction if they want to look at more additives, more chemicals, things like that, or more ways to reduce the amount of nitrogen and everything else that's going into the water. But I think at the end of the day, we all know that one of the biggest things we can do is have more fresh water flowing in. If that water wasn't sitting there, if it wasn't getting hotter, if it wasn't stagnating, if it was getting moved and pumped and dissipated, things would be a lot better. And but that's not the case in the Delta region. And if we get the Delta tunnel, if we get voluntary agreements that go through, we're only going to see this problem get worse. So if you want to learn any more about this, if you want to do a deep dive, here's some links where you can kind of look into a little more about it. And there's some tips there to protect your dog as well when you're hiking and you're out and about. Cats too, I think a lot of that applies. But at the end of the day, what can we do as our little posse of Stop the Delta Tunnel folks? So you now have that link to see the map, to see the incident reports. So when you see HABs, go report them on there. They'll have someone come out, check it out, see how dangerous it is. And of course, come to these meetings every Wednesday, especially next week, so we can talk about the updates I gave you earlier and what we're going to do about that, and the oil spill and this new infrastructure bill. Join our Facebook group if you haven't already, and then look out for our calls to action. I'm expecting we'll probably send something out Monday. If not Monday, then before the next metropolitan meetings. And then we'll probably have something targeted at Newsom as well in the next coming weeks. So that's it for the slideshow. I'm just reminding you that we are still recording. So any questions that you have, nope, not the right one. How do I just double this? Where did this go? Oh, just kidding. Great at technology. So just a reminder that the recording is still on, because I think we do want to capture the questions and comments, because folks always have some great stuff to say. But yes, just be mindful that the camera is still rolling. So any questions or comments? You can just unmute yourself. Oh, that's a great document. Thanks for sharing, Doug. David, you want to say something?
Oh, yeah, dumb question, I guess. But do HABs occur in storage and dams? I mean, everything you've talked about is, natural areas, but I'm wondering, and I'm thinking really of another way of attacking dams, but is there a danger? Are you seeing it in dams also?
My guess would be no, that they're probably on top of that, but I don't know enough to say for sure. It doesn't look like we have Deirdre tonight, so I'm not gonna say for sure, but I can also look into that and get back to you with when I follow up with the links tonight. So I'll write that down that you want to know that.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in that too, because it seems like with the water level dropping the way it has in the dams, that it's the same kind of, than stagnant water sitting around heating up, that it would be a recipe.
Yeah, that's certainly what it sounds like. I think it's got all the factors that contribute to it. I would just hope that they would stay on top of that a little more. Also, not every algae bloom is dangerous, but it's certainly a possibility. Also, we only talked about freshwater algae blooms. There are some in saltwater. That's just not really a focus of our concern with the Delta, but just letting folks know that. Any other questions or comments? So if you came in late, I think a handful of folks did. I'm going to share the agenda again. The agenda for tonight had some links in it that talk about other things we were talking about tonight. There's a vote tonight. By now, it probably already happened. I'm not sure, about the water infrastructure bill that some folks are trying to pass that would definitely affect the tunnel, other water storage, probably Poseidon, other awful projects. Sierra Club hasn't made an official stance on it yet, but I think it's good to get ahead of it before all of that red tape stuff happens. And send an email if you can. I think even if they already voted in the last 5 minutes, it's still important to kind of let your voice be heard. Let them know that they're being watched. That it's not the end of our dealings with Orange County water. So it's always important to let them know. And then as this bill progresses, we'll definitely let you know what happens. We'll probably take some actions. I posted in there also just the oil spill. The Angeles chapter made a page dedicated to the oil spill updates. They're going to do a town hall, great opportunity to ask questions like Andrew was saying before about, why is it that we didn't hear about this until Sunday or a little later when we know it happened at least a Friday, maybe earlier. Where's the transparency on that? And what the heck are we going to do about these oil spills? So things like that. And then I will also send you a link to volunteer with the state if you're interested. You will need some training unless you're already an expert, but I don't think anyone here is, about how to clean up oil spills. If you're from another part of the state, you're welcome to stay with me in LA if you are dying to get out here and clean up this oil spill. But you don't have the means, just let me know and we'll figure something out. So we've got those things going on. And then next week is our strategy meeting. And by then, hopefully we should have some more answers from our allies about those MET updates, some more decisions. And by then we will have heard back from Adele about his voluntary agreements and pushing those through. So it seems like right now we've got a whole whirlwind of awful things coming up the pipe, but we're going to be organized. We're going to figure it out in that strategy meeting, and we're not going to let any of these things fall through the cracks. We're going to tackle them all because ultimately they all either affect the Delta or affect water in California as a whole. So we will be on top of it. Any other questions? Oh, and I will encourage you to think about now for next week. So I already touched on it a little bit about what's going on with MET. So just think about, what do you think we should be doing when we get to that meeting next week? And what do you think is the right response? What's appropriate? Just a question about desalination. Better than Delta. I'm not sure what you mean. I think you mean, is it better than the tunnel? So desalination.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm too
Better than the
ignorant to
tunnel.
yeah, that's it.
Yeah, brackish water desalination is usually okay. With ocean water desalination, it's really got to be the very last resort. It's got to be when there's nothing else on the table. I think some folks have said that we didn't fight San Diego too hard on it because San Diego really doesn't have any other local water sources. But when there are other options, like Orange County has other options, they don't need Poseidon. They don't need. There's a lot of places that do not need any more ocean desalination. So when they don't need it, we're definitely going to fight it. It's very damaging for the radius around a desalination plant. It's just not good. Also, terrible fact, where the oil spill hit is where they were planning to put the Poseidon desalination plant. So if that pipeline is there, if that's a permanent structure and this happens again, and it's going to affect the water that would be sucked up through a desalination plant, then what's the point? And now is this water going to be contaminated for years and years and years? Do they really want to build a desalination plant there? And I hope that's a talking point that people will return to over and over again, because is that water people want to drink, knowing that it was just exposed to this deadly oil spill where they're not even letting volunteers near it? That's how toxic it is, but they're expecting people to drink that water eventually. So, that would be a huge problem if that happened. And is desalination better than the tunnel? I think it just depends on your perspective of, are you trying to save a freshwater area? Are you trying to save an ocean area? They're all bad and they're all expensive. We are always going to say that local sustainable projects are the best answer, such as water recycling, gray water, stormwater capture, those kinds of projects. Any other questions or comments?
Well, I was just going to say, I think Sacramento is actually looking at updating its building code at some point to require gray water
Nice.
recycling. And I mean, the stuff is still very much in the air. It's an interesting bunch of trade-offs, because we've been working on building electrification, getting rid of gas in buildings. And that costs jobs to the plumbers and pipe fitters. So there's starting to be alliances where, they will support electrification if electrification groups in turn support gray water, which is actually another real benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, wow, that's interesting. I've heard some groups saying that they are now working with pipe fitters to say, hey, if you drop the gas pipelines, we'll all work together to get more water pipeline projects, which can be okay if those pipeline projects are about fixing existing infrastructure. There's a lot of repairs needed throughout the state. 10% of water in the state is leaked through leaky pipelines, as long as it's not about new water conveyances, but I'm sure that'll be a battle in the future. Yeah, that's an interesting fact. Thanks for letting us know that, Karen. All right, anything else? Okay, this recording will be on the website sometime soon, and send an email to Orange County Water if you haven't already. It's always good that they hear from you. Otherwise, we will see you next week and look for any alerts from us about all of this. So thanks, folks. Have a good night.
you.
Bye.
Bye.